So we're very pleased today to have Francisco Martin-Rayo, CEO and co-founder of Helios AI, join us. Helios is an AI-powered climate risk and commodity intelligence platform that tracks over 80 commodities across 100 countries. Francisco is a former avocado trader turned entrepreneur. He spent his career at the intersection of agricultural markets, technology, and climate adaptation. Prior to founding Helios AI, Francisco was a principal at BCG, leading digital transformation, and was chief commercial officer at Deep Labs AI. He holds a MPP from Harvard, where I know him from, and undergraduate degrees, plural, from Penn. His analysis on commodity market disruption has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Nikkei Asia. And as hopefully you all saw in the pre-reading, he wrote a very prescient analysis of the emerging trends affecting agricultural markets and specifically fertilizer and supply chains as a consequence of the Hormuz crisis. And we're very pleased to have him here to present and extend that analysis. So Francisco, please go ahead. We look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the invite. It's great to be here. It's great to chat. I'm happy to share a few slides if helpful, but I would love, and Jonathan, I defer to you, please ask questions. I don't know if it's a raise your hand thing or you put them in the chat. Whatever it is, I'd rather not talk at you for 20 or 30 minutes. I think it'll be more exciting. And the other part we'll say is we come from a view of, and I think we talked about this earlier, like we work almost exclusively with large procurement teams that are buying these ag commodities globally. And so we can give you kind of our macro view, but I think a lot of the information that from our understanding that you guys have is incredibly valuable, right, in terms of what you're seeing on the ground, what you're hearing from your partners, your stakeholders. So I'd love for it to be a broader conversation, not just for us, right, but I'm sure there's so much that you guys can share with each other as well in terms of what you're seeing going on the ground, what's happening, how we mitigate some of these risks, how we can help. So as much as possible, please engage, raise your hands, ask questions.
Francisco, if you could go ahead and present some of your analysis, that'd be fantastic. And we have reserved time for Q&A. And if you would like to seed questions in the chat as Francisco is speaking, please go ahead and do that. We'll try and circle back to as many as we can.
Perfect.
And as soon as you want to dive into the discussion, Francisco, you're welcome to pause and start fielding questions. I'm sure there will be many.
Great. So what I was hoping we could talk about today was kind of the food system shock that nobody was covering initially. And the reason I say that is when what was interesting for us, and still today, right, is a lot of the coverage we see is very energy dependent, oil especially, and natural gas, and was almost exclusively energy dependent at the beginning of the crisis. And one of the things that we pushed hard for, and as did other people, right, I think the FT's done a really nice job, is understanding what is the impact of what's happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz more broadly for the food system. And so what I thought is we could start with kind of an overview of where we started, where we are today, what the future looks like, what we really worry about, and then some potential mitigants for some of your stakeholders. This is really the story of two particular shocks, right? And so on the left-hand side, obviously that's the Strait of Hormuz, February 28th, when the beginning of the attacks on Iran happened, that basically shut down, right? I believe we still have the American blockade in addition to some of the Iranian blockade, right, that is going on today. But from a fertilizer perspective, 30 to 50% of the world's urea goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And so that was kind of the beginning of the crisis on the 28th. And then on March 18th, what you're seeing there in the picture were the missile attacks on the Ras Laffan plant in Qatar. And so initial estimates, and we haven't seen them change necessarily was that 17 to 18% of total production in Ras Laffan was basically taken out by the missiles. Obviously, the plant has been shut down since the beginning of the conflict. But that they've said, the head of COFCO, that it might take 3 to 5 years for that 18% to come back online, which is really extraordinary when you think about it, because 10 to 14% of the global urea market comes out of Qatar. The Gulf hubs produce 50% of total sulfur, which is a key ingredient in overall phosphate. And so for us, it's one of the things that's really interesting about where we are in the world today is that you have really large shocks that occur, and then kind of the media or the storyline moves past them. And one of the things I think that is really important as we continue to do collectively our analysis of is remembering some of these big events and the shocks that have not changed. And so we always need to remember 18% of that capacity is out, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, even if everything went back to normal today. And so what does that mean? Who is most impacted and when? What was interesting, again, at the beginning, when we look at the Northern Hemisphere, US and Europe, we're just entering into spring, perfect time. What's really interesting, I would say, the United States is blessed in many ways. One of the ways it's blessed in is that the United States produces 75% of the fertilizer it uses domestically. And so the impacts, right, the prices have gone up of certain things, obviously fertilizer, we'll talk about that, obviously diesel. But generally, in terms of the planting, most farmers in the Northern Hemisphere had pre-purchased it. And so we've seen US corn, soy crop largely unaffected. In the Delta and New Orleans, they typically wait until the last minute to decide what they're going to plant. And so we're starting to see some evolution away from corn, which requires a lot of fertilizer, and instead into soy, which is largely self-fertilizing. But broadly, right, the impact has not been bad. What we worry about, right, is more of the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil, Argentina, Southeast Asia, right? And I think a lot of the conversation here, and we'd love to hear from you, is this really is for many folks almost an Asian crisis from a fuel perspective, but from our side, especially from a fertilizer perspective. And part of it is because they are forced today to start to buy the fertilizer that they would for the planting that will occur later on. And so you have that immediate exposure to disruption in area prices. The impact is likely severe. Some analysis we did in Myanmar, we're seeing 60% plus increase in input costs. Brazil's June and August buying window aligns exactly with the disruption period. We're seeing what's happening in India, right? I think Modi came out a couple of days ago and said, please stop buying gold. And so you're starting to see a lot of that disruption start to hit. And one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking through is, what does it look like to get back to normal? And excuse one of the images here, but there's 3 things that have to occur before we get back to normal, right? To a state before. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind. One is what you're seeing on the first picture is a demining vessel from the US Navy. And so even if we assume that we had a true ceasefire or cessation of hostilities today, right? Again, let's just assume Iran and the United States come to an agreement, everybody abides by it, we're good. They say, we're going to reopen the Strait. You have to demine the Strait first. Iran has already said publicly that they do not remember all of the places where they put mines. And so that's going to be a real undertaking. Number 2, Lloyd's, you have to have insurance rates go back down so that it becomes economic again to start transporting through the Strait of Hormuz. And then 3, you have to have captains who are crazy enough to start transporting their ships again through the Strait of Hormuz. Once all 3 of those things happen, then you can start to see real movement again through the Strait of Hormuz of certain commodities. But what I think is really important from a food perspective is, we had dinner, a larger dinner with a retired admiral last week on this, and his estimate was that it could take up to 2.5 years for things to return to normal, just from a naval operations point of view, based on the analysis they've done of the last time the Strait was closed. And so even after the demining happens, insurance rates go back down, that it becomes economic, you have enough captains who are willing to transit the Strait, the first thing that you're going to start transporting isn't going to be fertilizer, it's going to be oil. Because the cash price of a barrel of oil in Singapore has ranged sometimes as high as $185. That is not what you're going to get for fertilizer. And so what I think is really important is our baseline understanding is even if you have a cessation of hostilities tomorrow, you're probably not going to get more fertilizer out of the region this year. And so what does that really mean? It's three shocks that are happening all at once. One is the energy and logistics shock, which we've talked about. And that's, you're seeing it from a diesel perspective, refrigerated freight. That's already underway. That's really the only part that's hitting, I would say, the United States right now, but obviously having much broader implications globally. Two, what we consider starting in Q3, the Southern Hemisphere input squeeze. And so that's, you're seeing South American, Southeast Asian farmers purchasing these inputs right in the middle of the disruption window. That's where you start to see, are you starting to plant different types of crops that are less fertilizer intensive? Are you planting crops that, are you putting in less fertilizer into your crops? Either way, the expectation is, one, you're going to have lower production overall of the crops that are very intensive from a fertilizer perspective. You also expect lower yields generally because your input costs are so high. And then the last point is you continue to have what we call structural pressure. And so this is something we really, really worry about in kind of early 2027, if not longer. So if you have initially, like, your input costs are becoming more expensive, but generally the Northern Hemisphere had already bought everything they needed. And so you have kind of higher prices starting to flow through. Now that you are doing the pre-buying in the Southern Hemisphere, you're starting to make those trade-offs. And so if we assume and we know that your production and yield is going to be lower, by 2027, what does that mean? You're going to start to put a lot of pressure on your existing stocks and grain stocks, which are, I mean, if you're China, they've done a really good job of building that up. If you're India, you have not. I mean, they've been pretty open about that. And so you're in a lot of, I think a lot of other countries have not as well. They don't really have as high number of stocks as you would want. And so what we really worry about is there is a real distinction that I think is important to keep in our minds. A price shock versus a physical unavailability shock is what we call it. What we're seeing right now in many parts is you are still getting some of the inputs that you need, right? You're still able to buy, whether it's the inputs or your outputs around maize, soy, wheat, obviously, and we can talk about that in a second, sorghum, etc. It's just a lot more expensive than it used to be. At some point in the crisis, you're going to move away from this just being a price shock to what we call a physical unavailability shock. And that means you are not able to get that particular commodity at any price. And that's where you start to see some export restrictions. We've seen historically export restrictions before, right? We know India restricts exports of sugar during election season, as an example. We've seen them restrict rice exports. I think a couple of years ago, we've seen Indonesia restrict exports. And that's restricting exports at a time where you don't have this level of stress in your overall kind of food supply chain. It is only a matter of time, I think, before we go from, we have a price shock crisis that is squeezing everybody, to we're coming to an availability crisis that gets a lot harder. Then, we're a climate risk company. To make things worse, El Nino arrives. We've been hearing a lot of a super El Nino. Again, we're tracking it. What's interesting about El Nino is it impacts countries very, very differently. And so in some countries, it increases drought pretty significantly. In some countries, it increases flooding pretty significantly, and it impacts crops very, very differently. We do a lot of work in Thailand on pineapple. That's a very different impact than you would have in corn or soy in Brazil, as an example. So in Brazil, obviously, what we're focused on is soy and corn, and MENA, wheat and grains, right? And then obviously in the south, we have rice and palm oil. And it is across each of these, what we're seeing is almost a triple overlap, right? You have the climate issues, fertilizer issues, export revenue risk, or import dependency, or currency risk. At any point, we spend a ton of time with farmers, large and small. I think farming is probably the hardest, most optimistic job you have to have in the world. If everything is perfect, right? Your weather is perfect, your input costs are low, your harvest worked out really well, you make a few percentage points. If anything goes wrong, you lose money. Given everything that's going on, we don't see how the vast majority of farms don't lose money, especially smallholder farmers over the next year or so. Again, that could change, but this is something we really worry about. And so really just last, really the last 2 points is one, how does the current ongoing crisis compare to what we've seen historically? And so we just wanted to look at the two most recent food crises. One is the 07-08 price shock, right? The trigger was drought and biofuel demand and export bans. Wheat price increased pretty dramatically, right? I think the World Bank put this figure at 120% plus. Fertilizer was 200% plus. 105 million people were pushed into poverty. Food riots occurred in 37 countries. There was a huge level of instability. One of the things that I think is really important to note is we're talking about this as a food crisis today. We know we're probably going to get to the availability scenario by next year. Again, just based on some of these assumptions we have, that even if there's a cessation of hostilities, it's going to take too long to get back to normal. It will soon become a geopolitical crisis as well, where you're going to see a lot of these countries that don't have access to these grain stocks feel an enormous amount of pressure from their populations because they will not have access to basic feeds, kind of basic food staples, if you will. We think it's probably closer to the 07-08 than the 22. 22 was more of a logistics shock, right? I think obviously the wheat price went up, not as much. But what's interesting here is that there is a real distinction, I think, with how countries like Sudan were impacted versus kind of the global stocks. And I do want to spend a little bit of time on this because one of the things that I think would be really interesting to chat through together, there's an ongoing theory right now that says, the international system that we've all grown up in, right, is changing to be apolitical about it. And we don't necessarily know what's replacing it, but we are starting to hear more and more that from a supply chain perspective, one of the things that's likely to change is this idea of one global price, which wasn't always one global price, right? But you know what the price of soybeans were. There were some transportation costs. Sometimes you have some tariffs domestically, but broadly, everybody knew what the price of corn was, what the price of soybeans was, what the price of wheat was, in terms of the global price, what the price of oil was. As the international system continues to evolve or erode, one of the things that we're really watching is, does that one global price framework disappear? And so you end up in a scenario where Brazil is selling to a particular block. Sometimes you're paying in dollars, sometimes you're paying in yuan, sometimes you don't have access to corn or soy or wheat based on what your political or alliance systems is. And that's a very different environment, I think, than what we've seen over the last few decades. In terms of where we think this will land, I think we know what the triggers are. Obviously, the MENA grain importers carry a lot of the risk. We've talked about fertilizer. We've seen the numbers. We don't know. We don't know how much worse it's likely to be, but we know it's compounding an already elevated and undernourished baseline of folks. And so what we're seeing is here it's a combination of both a logistics shock and a price shock that is likely to turn into an availability shock. I see a bunch of comments. Okay. Um,
Thank you, Francisco.
Yeah.
Before we dive into questions, I wanted to ask our members if you have hard data and/or anecdata around what the impacts are for the farmers you serve on the ground. If you could share those either in the chat or as part of your questions. And when you do ask questions, for Francisco's background, please introduce who you are, the organization you're representing, and what types of farmers you work with as a preamble. Jim, I think you were first off the mark, so please go ahead.
Maybe can you just take off the screen so we can see each other?
I can, yeah. I just had 2 more slides if helpful.
Okay. Well,
Maybe you
please
should
go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly, we wanted to be helpful here, and so we said, hey, what can we do, right? So we didn't want to just bring you some problems, but again, you guys are much closer to the day-to-day. The 3 things I think we're hearing is, 1, as much as possible, try and pre-position inputs, right? We don't think the prices are going to go down necessarily, so as much as you can, help folks bulk purchase, urea, DAP, negotiate volume contracts now if you can. Better to have a price shock than an availability concern. 2, as much as possible, unlock smallholder credit. There's a lot of issues with farm financing, but now is the time, I think, to push, especially agricultural lending, as hard as humanly possible to try and create that working capital. And then 3, right, and this is where I think this type of forum is so helpful. Continue to share ground level signals. I think this is a really helpful way to get that early warning system, and both share what folks are seeing on the ground and what's working. That was, yeah, over to you here. Yeah, we'd love to have the broader conversation.
Great material, Francisco. Thanks a lot for sharing this. Lots of places to dive in. I'll kind of come in at one of the earlier points you made. I'm Jim Taylor from, we're primarily from in Southeast Asia, of course, which has been really hit by the multitude of this crisis. A couple of things in early on, this idea that if the war, or if the Strait was open tomorrow, the war ended, then it would take 6 months, maybe 2.5 years for logistical trade. Have any thoughts on this idea that actually part of the international order has broken down in terms of law of sea and navigational rights? Broadly speaking, is there a potential here we're going to see built-in risk premiums on petroleum and fertilizer? Even if the Strait was open, it could be closed again. Or other key points. The Maluku Strait off of Singapore is huge. If that ever got contested, would create disruptions across Asia. So this idea that there could be built-in risk premiums that will elevate prices for petroleum and fertilizer. That's the sort of the one part of the question or the observation. The second part is, what if the Strait isn't resolved for another 6 months or 9 months? Does that change any of your scenarios?
Yeah, I really like this idea of built-in risk premiums. The more risk there is, the more expensive things become in the supply chain perspective. I think to your point, exactly right. Since the end of World War II, with some exceptions, broadly, there was this idea of like territorial integrity. Certainly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, obviously there are differences, right? You could say the Soviet Union. If you're Polish, you didn't necessarily feel that, but I guess you're still technically Poland. But what was really interesting to us, if you look at the last 30 years, right, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States, right, and the international system said, hey, we don't do this anymore. We don't just take over countries. We're going to come in, we're going to kick you out. And then things obviously changed after, since then somewhat, but there was this idea that Russia has invaded big parts of Ukraine and broadly said, hey, we don't really do this. I think that is no longer a given. This idea that in an international system, territorial integrity is relatively sacrosanct. Everybody knows the fraying that we're seeing across the different, Western alliance system that exists. One of the most interesting things we heard that we're tracking is the Saudi Arabia-UAE rift. And so the chair of the Shura Council in Saudi Arabia a couple months ago in a public interview said, at the end of the day, the UAE is just a province of Riyadh. And that was really interesting, right? Because in all of our analysis, we always assume a relatively set of rules, if you will, or a set of countries. But what's stopping, I'm not saying it's going to happen, right? A country like Saudi Arabia from saying, well, our 2030 vision isn't going so well, and we've had to really cut back, and we're not really able to build this financial world capital. We should just take over the UAE. Historically, it'd say, well, that's insane, right? Why? People don't do that anymore, and someone would come in and stop them. I don't know if that's the case anymore. And so, Jim, to your point on kind of built-in risk, I think the level of geopolitical risk that we're going to see is dramatically higher, which will both make things a lot more expensive and often harder to get. And then just quickly to your second point, I think what's missing in the broader conversation is the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed for 6 months. I just don't see how it opens in 6 months, even if we had a cessation of hostilities tomorrow. Right. And that's not a political comment. We just mean, so many things need to happen, right? The three things we talked about, but then you have to turn on a lot of these production facilities again. From an oil perspective, one field in Saudi Arabia has 5,000 wells. And so that's 5,000 wells that are turned off, that have to be turned on kind of individually.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John, and then Debbie. I'm just seeing your hands, if that's easier, John.
Thanks, Francisco. Nice to meet you. I'm John from One Acre Fund. So I just came off a presentation from Maximo from the chief economist of FAO, and interestingly, very similar conversation to this. Two things that surprised me, their reflections, but would also love your reflection over my reflection. One is FAO's predicting real seed shortages because of the intensification required for fertilizer on seed production, which I don't think we've factored in fully into our risk assessment, right? Because we distribute and finance a lot of inputs, but I hadn't really connected the dots of hybrid maize seed and the shortage of those seeds. Obviously, we're operating in sub-Saharan Africa in contexts where African countries don't generally have negotiating power. So one of the things we're already seeing is some countries are losing out in the international fertilizer markets. And I think maybe that will happen in seed as well, where the global north is able to purchase those products and outbid the global south. And we've seen that with some of our suppliers already. So I think there's quite a few knock-on impacts. One of the other ones that I was flagging to Maximo and we're starting to think about is really domestic fuel use for agricultural logistics, because we're seeing countries like Burundi and Malawi have currency protections. We can't export dollars. They also they really are very challenged from an FX perspective, so they're unable to buy fuel even before a price shock. But we're seeing quite significant fuel shortages in quite a few countries. And so when we look at things like alternatives, biofertilizers, etc., one of the challenges is still the cost of those products because of the transportation issue, not because of their production. For example, some of the biofertilizers we're testing, they require a 2 or 3x application rate compared to synthetics for yield increases, which means you need to truck 2 or 3 times the volume of those products at scale. So anyway, those are just a few things, hidden issues I've picked up on in the analysis at FAO. Wondered if you're looking at some of those kind of hidden aspects of the agricultural logistics systems.
That's super interesting, John. I hadn't heard the seed shortage, but it makes a ton of sense. just to your point on using fertilizer alternatives, we're very close to a couple of, these large CPGs have the global heads of regenerative agriculture and sustainability and global heads of ag. And one of the things they talk about a lot is, in this presentation, we didn't really talk about climate change. The analogy that I've made for years now is, if you guys watched Game of Thrones, right, you have the day-to-day fighting that happens between the different families or clans, right? But then what everybody needs to worry about are the White Walkers or the zombies, right, that are coming down. And that's your big thing. Obviously, the crisis that's happening now is really difficult, but to your point in terms of the amount of fertilizer application that you would have to put in order to get ahead of some of these things, it makes it so much worse with climate change. We work with, I think, one of the largest retailers, certainly in the UK, probably in Europe. And before the war started, their global head of procurement had said, they've been doing this for 30 years. The UK basically has to import everything that they're eating, not everything, but a lot. And they said they have never seen this level of volatility and disruption across their global produce chain. And we asked him what it was attributed to, and he said, well, climate change. And so across everything that we're seeing and we're talking about, right, you continue to see higher and higher levels of disruption because of climate change, which just kind of exacerbates this. But that's super interesting. I hadn't heard the seed shortage, but it makes a ton of sense. Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that climate change issue is that, we always thought about farmers needing to be climate resilient to climate shocks, but now it's operations resilience, more than climate shocks. It's all these other big shocks. But anyway, my question was, for Southeast Asia, it seems like some of the countries like Thailand are doing side deals with Iran to get more energy supply. And is that energy supply going through the Strait, or is that also affected when they do side deals, Southeast Asia? Or, what is that also a supply issue later down the road?
It's a really good question. What we've heard anecdotally is that about 40% of the oil that used to go through the Strait of Hormuz is now going kind of in other areas, right, which still leaves that 60%. And Iran, before the blockade, was allowing its own ships, right, to transit out before the U.S. blockade. I don't know if that's still going on. But Debbie, to your point, right, like, as you start to see more and more of these shortages, you could see us going back to, again, like the breakdown of that one price for a commodity. And then it says, you country X cannot buy either fertilizer or natural gas or oil at any price, because, and then you start using commodities as a real lever for political needs. And not just, you choose what type of oil you want from where you want it, et cetera, et cetera. Again, and the market wasn't never that, easy, right? You could, but broadly, right? I mean, there was so much analysis done on why the sanctions against Russia after the Ukraine war weren't really effective. It's because people were still buying a lot of Russian oil, especially China and India. And you had to get a discount, which hurt Russia somewhat, but really kind of benefited China and India. But you wonder if that starts to really disappear and become even more frayed, right?
Yeah, like it's a breakdown of WTO.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. What other things are? Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Thanks, Francisco. Really appreciate the presentation. I'm Tracy Bain from the Cash Coalition. Really glad to be here and to have you with us today. My question is for you as well as maybe everyone on the call. I'm curious about what we can learn from history from the prior shocks that happened that you outlined in the presentation, and what type of adaptation measures were taken by farmers, whether it's smallholder, whether it's even in larger holder farmers, in response to those shocks? And can we expect to see that again this time, or do the adaptation measures need to change even further because this is likely going to last a while? El Nino is coming, we have all these compounding effects. So just curious if anyone here, honestly, on the call is starting to see those adaptation measures happen right now or planning for it, and do you expect them to look the same as what happened in the past, or will they have to be different?
I can speak to Ukraine a little bit, but I think there are other folks on the line who are much more experienced about it than I am. We do some work with the government in Ukraine on kind of the impacts of climate change and how that should inform what the farmers are planting, especially in the frontier regions. Because in the frontier regions, they can't really put irrigation in because of all the kind of the ongoing war. What was really fascinating, just again in the Ukrainian context, is that the two things that were surprising is there was almost like an understanding between Russia and Ukraine that said, well, yeah, we're at war and we're killing. I mean, I think there's 25 or 35,000 Russians that are, killed or wounded every month. I don't know what the Ukrainian numbers are. So despite everything that's going on, we're going to allow shipments of certain grain feeds through either land or now, the Black Sea. I think once Ukraine was able to secure that. And so there was an understanding that despite how bad the war is, well, there's certain things that we still need this level of food security. But the really interesting part, as Russia took over kind of the parts of Ukraine that it's controlling now, they started tilling the land and growing stuff and exporting it. And so it's been a huge revenue source for them during the war in a way that we hadn't expected. I mean, it's surprising and a bit cruel, right, that they were able to take over the territory and basically start planting it and selling it, because it is kind of a huge food basin. But I'd love to hear what other folks have heard in terms of how folks are reacting. Jonathan?
No, well, I wasn't going to answer your question, but if people would like to contribute, please go ahead. I have a separate question.
I'll chime in. Alexandra, Root Capital. Coffee is what I'll talk about, smallholder coffee. And I'm thinking about, for example, COVID that also put a lot of pressure on operations, to Debbie's point, and cost of transportation for all the different logistical reasons that we're aware of. I think we did see a sort of a re-recognition of the importance of local inputs, organic, self-produced inputs, more regenerative agriculture. I think the question right now is it too little, too late, right? Not to put even more of a damper on this conversation, but Francisco, with what you're describing around and what John also raised, you need 2 to 3 times more inputs in volume and weight, and all that requires transportation. It makes a case, especially for the smaller farmers, for associative structures. So working with the local co-ops, working with local businesses, agri-SMEs, because they're often able to, facilitate shorter distances of travel, technical know-how so that farmers can produce their own. It's never going to be, not never, but not in the short term, not soon enough going to be optimal, right? When you're just still learning or only relying on what you can find on your farm and around your farm. But that's one of the things that I think we might be looking at and might need to actually help support, is the working together, the keeping distances for travel short where possible, at least on the production side. I still have lots of questions and concerns about getting the crop out. But in terms of keeping the crop healthy, that's something we saw some of, and I think we might see more of. Tracy and I were at an event in London recently, a corporate event, and it was all about regen ag. So I also see sort of corporates, the difference between the conversation 2 weeks ago and 20 years ago, for me, the one difference is seeing that corporates are seeing regenerative agriculture as a business imperative. and no longer as sort of a nice to have to be able to charge customers more and sound green, but really as a survival imperative. So that's also maybe a shift I see from other shocks.
Other folks? I think Debbie, you have your hand up.
Oh, I think Debo had a
Yeah.
point also.
Sorry.
Well,
Thibaut, I don't know if you could articulate that. It's a very interesting point you've made in the chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Thibaut from Proximity Design. We operate in Myanmar. So yeah, like I think the key difference from a Southeast Asian and let's say rice producing country perspective is that in 2022 when you had the shock following the Russia-Ukraine war, so fertilizer price went up, but the paddy prices were up and remained kept on growing. So basically, farmer felt that the environment was favorable to invest, so still buy fertilizer even though the price was rising. But this is the very, very different situation with today, where basically international rice prices have been low for over a year. And now they are their lowest point over the last 5 to 7 years. So then it really changed. You were talking about adaptation strategy. So I think that it really changed the perspective when we start thinking about those.
Super interesting. Jonathan, I'll let you call on folks. Yeah.
I wanted to piggyback on what Alexandra was saying, and asking if you're tracking any of investments that are accelerating in biofertilizer production and things like that in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world. Because I think this longer term, this might be an interesting trend to track.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It's a couple of things, and others please add. The funding market for ag tech has been in a depression for the last few years. It's absolute garbage, and a big reason for that. I mean, we don't count as ag tech, I think, which is why we've been able to be so successful. But we have a lot of friends who run ag tech companies. We go to a lot of these ag tech events, and it's just horrible. A big part of that is because the go-to-market is almost impossible, right? I mean, it's really, really difficult to sell to farmers. I think farmers are really, really good at innovating and being early adopters eventually, right? And you have the questions are, well, does this work? And how much does it cost? And am I going to get an ROI? Because your businesses are so low margin that you don't really have a lot of space to innovate if it's not going to work out. But once it's proven that it works out, what we've seen is there's incredible adoption of new technologies, which is kind of wonderful, right? I think, but there's not a ton of funding out there. And then, especially for the fertilizer companies, I mean, now they're starting to make a lot of money, which means they'll be able to have good investments again. But I mean, even folks like Yara, right, in Europe, where it's harder to fire people, they went through a pretty serious downsizing a couple of years ago because they were doing so badly. You saw the same thing at ADM. You saw the same thing at Cargill. I don't know Bunge or Dreyfus, but the capital environment in the region in the industry has been so bad for so long that this is the first time where folks are seeing their margins go back up. So I think it'll take a long time to start to make those investments again.
Yeah, I just saw a report the other day that said that, the investment environment is horrible, but the biggest sector is in these bio inputs. I think it was 39% of the deals were in these alternative fertilizers. But overall, it's really bad. Can I just add one other factor I think that's really big we're seeing in Southeast Asia? It might be the canary in the coal mine for sub-Saharan Africa as well, as just with the petroleum prices, we're just seeing overall inflation really go up, and that includes food inflation. Interestingly enough, property inflation's gone way up as people see volatile currencies, they see shaky food supplies, they go into assets that they move their money into different assets. The de-dollarization of Southeast Asian economies see it rapidly hitting, and I think and then once you get inflationary environments, of course, then that begins to choke off credit that eventually could be available for farmers as central banks raise interest rates to cool inflation and things. It's just becomes really a tough cycle to operate in for credit markets. Then obviously investment markets, but even just farm level credit is getting one, risky, and two, interest rates are, I predict, are going to go up.
Yeah, there was a really good, and I'll see if I can share this with the team. There was an excellent interview with the president of the Chicago Fed that said that what they really worry about, certainly globally and domestically, is that you're entering this period of stagflation where the crisis is creating, very high inflation outside the United States, much higher than it is in the United States, right? But still very high for U.S. standards. Incredibly high inflation at the same time that you're seeing generally very little to low economic growth and certainly no hiring. I mean, I think the people are so focused on the stock market rally, but the stock market rally is the most concentrated in terms of the number of few stocks, most concentrated rally that they've ever had historically.
Why it's diverging from what's happening in the global economies. That's
a
lot of stuff writing about that lately. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, to your point, you could see how you end up exactly in this place where your inflation continues to go up, your input prices continue to go up, and you end up in a recession. And then interest rates really you don't have a lot of levers there to do much, and it just ends up in a cycle of a fair bit of pain.
Yeah.
Stephen, maybe from Region Organics? I think Jonathan.
Stephen, sorry to put you on the spot, but I was curious if you could contribute, given that you guys supply biological inputs, what impact this is having on demand, as well as any potential impacts on your input costs. Would be very interesting to know about. He may have stepped away. But anyone else, please go ahead. And we've got Zambia, Caribbean perspectives, and others that would be wonderful to hear from.
I've already spoken, but I'll just say one other thing that is a challenge is when you're operating across multiple countries, the presence of alternatives is a key barrier. So there's not a lot of technology transfer happening regionally. And so in theory, decentralization of green ammonia, biofertilizers, bioinputs would be one of the big solutions for this crisis. However, when you work across countries that have had little to no investment in these new technologies, it's very hard to rapidly expand into new markets. Right. And so I think, that was also FAO's assessment, is like a lot of the things that we need to do to be a more resilient agri-food system globally are 4 years out. And they're predicting that it's going to be 2 or 3 years of pain before we can get to that place where there's a more decentralized system of resilient products and services. I guess just one question, since I've got the microphone, sorry. FAO also have these time limits, so that they have kind of a 90-day threshold where they see after we pass that 90-day threshold, some of the yield impacts happen, and then 180 to 360 days is when they see the most severe food inflation happening, and we're at day 73 now. Are you looking at it in the same way, or is your assessment basically we're already pretty screwed?
Yeah, I promise I'm an optimist by nature. I really am. I don't see how we get out of this in the near term. I don't see how we, even with the cessation of hostilities, I don't see how you get the demining in time, insurance rates to go down, enough folks to transport, and then you get enough energy out that you can start, putting fertilizer out, right? Because that's less profitable. I just don't see how we get all of that in time for the planting season that's coming up. And humans were very innovative. We'll find a way. But I just don't see how we don't go through that pain. To me, it's similar than, one of the things we try in our analysis a lot is to figure out, are there certain immovable things that are happening, right? And so we spend a lot of time on AI, as you can imagine, right? And one of the things that we worry about, I think, as well, is the level of productivity increases that we're seeing in artificial intelligence. And this is kind of a non sequitur here, but is so extraordinary that you really don't need as many people as before. And a lot of the jobs are starting to disappear. And so you know, unless that changes, you are going to have pretty serious job impacts. And so that to me is almost immutable. Similarly for this particular crisis, right? Unless the framework dramatically changes, right? There's new innovations in terms of demining, or Iran suddenly finds out where all the mines are, or insurance rates drop precipitously. I just, you know, don't see how all of that happens, and you turn on your kind of industrial base, right, from a gas-fired perspective again, and you start producing. I just don't see how we do that in time, right? And it's hard, right? Because then if that is the case, then you're kind of screwed for at least the rest of the year, right? And then a lot of the writing comes out, but is there a ceasefire? Is not a ceasefire? What is Iran saying? It doesn't really matter that much, and I think that's not the most optimistic place to be, right? And analytically, it becomes kind of boring because people will come to you and say, well, does, you know, it looks like we're going to have or there is a ceasefire, or, you know, does that make a difference? And you just go, no. You know, once they start demining, then we could say, how hard is it, right? Things have changed, right, since the 80s, right? I think that's the last. I don't think we've invested a lot in demining capabilities. I don't think that technology has changed that much. But yeah, sorry, John. I wish I had a better answer, a more interesting one, but sometimes if these things are immutable, I don't know how you end up in a better outcome.
I don't want to hog a question if anybody else. I have a kind of slightly different topic as we come to the end of our hour. My question is quickly just, Francisco, really interested in your company. People have been trying to look at commodity markets for centuries. What are you guys doing that's as you're looking around corners here? What's your advantage over the traditional commodity futures company that's been around for?
I mean, we're really lucky. Like, we started in 2022. We both had, like, my co-founder Eden. She was a senior AI ML engineer at Google. She won the Abby Award. She'd been working on Palm. Palm is now Gemini. So we knew, we didn't know it was going to come this fast, but we kind of knew what was coming from a tech perspective. And we're really lucky in the sense that, like, we saw that compute was cheaper than ever before. We have 500 billion climate risk data points. We take daily weather readings from 14 million locations, I mean, every 24 hours. And that's temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind speed, all that stuff. And so, you know, we wouldn't have been able to do that as a company of our size 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Then algorithms got so much faster and so much better. And so we've been able to build kind of machine learning models that are specific to each crop. So my big criticism of the industry is people go, well, you know, we're looking at the number of high degree days. Who cares? It's totally irrelevant, right? Because the high degree days don't really matter, you know, depending on when in the growing season you are, where you are, and are you growing cocoa versus corn versus soy versus wheat versus sorghum, whatever, right? Everything has different ranges and all that. But now, because algorithms got so much better and compute is cheaper, you can build individual machine learning models that are really effective at predicting these disruptions. And you have better data than ever before, right? I mean, there's so many more satellites around the world and so many more weather stations. That's really what we feel very lucky in the sense that all three of those things didn't really exist before. And you know, the nice part is if you start a company from scratch, you don't have any of the legacy problems that like an S&P Global or an, you know, London Stock Exchange Group will have, where you're tied to these like garbage Excel models and kind of high level stuff. I mean, I know that sounds mean, but like, come on, some of these guys use the same model to forecast the price of pomegranates as plastic. That's just lazy, right? There's no excuse for something like that in 2026. Anyway, so that's go ahead, Debbie.
Are you saying your models can now predict, like at a more localized context, like for beyond, you know, just more finer grained than just the country or even
Oh wow, yeah,
farmers?
Yeah, we predict down to the 2-kilometer level. We predicted 90% of all the disruptions that have occurred over the last 10 years for the 77 commodities we cover. Again, from a weather and climate perspective, right? We cannot predict the geopolitics of it, but it's pretty cool. It's pretty remarkable what you can do these days.
They offer, I sat in on one last week, they offer routinely kind of demonstrations of the model. So you can sign up for one of those. It is fascinating. The one I sat in on went on a deep dive on the avocado supply chain in Mexico, and you could go all the way down to kind of county equivalent level to see what's happening. Very interesting.
Clearly important for buyers. You see applications on the producer side?
We're starting to, yeah. We have. We've always had a few large growers on the platform, but now we're starting to see even smaller farms, which we think is great.
And what do you think the value they see in it?
It's certainly not for their own farms, right? We're never going to know it's to look at their competition.
Right.
So if you're growing, the most recent smallholder farm we added was in Canada growing barley, and they're looking at the global barley market. Yeah, how's everybody else doing?
Right. That's interesting. It seems like some industry associations could be customers, who want to get good intelligence and distribute to their members.
Yeah. We'd love that.
Yeah.
Well, we are at time. Francisco, thank you. This has been fascinating. I'm sure we could stay here and pepper you for some time. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, and it's been a rich and very disturbing conversation. There's a lot more our farmers are going to need in the season to come and the year thereafter. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invite. It's great to meet everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Francisco.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.